All right, you ready for this? We're about to take a deep dive into something fascinating. It's all about Tantrism, that ancient practice that's kind of shrouded in mystery. We've got a stack of research here, all from a Christian perspective that's super critical of Tantra. Let's unpack this, shall we?
What's fascinating is how Tantra has traveled from ancient India all the way to modern Western culture. Along the way, it's picked up some interesting interpretations, especially in the form of Neo-Tantra.
Okay, so we're talking history, beliefs, and maybe even a bit of controversy, right?
Exactly. The sources we have here really dig into some core errors they see in Tantra, both from within its own logic and compared to Christianity.
Sounds like we're in for a wild ride. Here's where it gets really interesting. The chapters of this research are actually named after the supposed errors. Things like the serpent in the pardon of the soul, or the logic labyrinth. How cool is that?
That's a clever way to frame it. It really highlights the perspective we're looking at today. Ready to dive in?
Absolutely. Before we get to the errors, let's start with some background. Where did Tantra come from?
It originated in ancient India around the 5th or 6th century CE, emerging from the Vedic traditions. But unlike the Vedic focus on outward rituals, Tantra shifted towards internal contemplation and challenging societal norms.
So instead of just pleasing the gods with rituals, it's about inner exploration.
Right, precisely. We start seeing practices like mantras, mandalas, and yoga emerge, tools for tapping into inner energies and experiences.
And as Tantra spread to Tibet, Nepal, and Southeast Asia, I imagine it evolved and adapted, right?
Exactly. Each region developed its own unique flavor, creating this diverse family of traditions.
Okay, so there's no one Tantra. It's more like this ever-changing, multifaceted thing.
That's right, and this makes it even more interesting to see how it landed in the West, often with a lot of distortion along the way.
All right, let's talk about that journey west. How did Tantra go from ancient Indian temples to, say, yoga studios and wellness retreats today?
Well, early Western scholars often focused on the more sensational aspects of Tantra, like erotic sculptures and rituals. This created this image of Tantra as something exotic and taboo, which wasn't the whole picture.
Ah, so that popular image of Tantra has this, like, super sexy, mysterious thing that's not quite accurate.
Not entirely, but it definitely shaped how Tantra was perceived, especially during the 1960s counterculture movement, where people sought alternatives to traditional religion. Tantra's emphasis on breaking free from societal norms really resonated with that movement.
It became a symbol of rebellion, of personal liberation. It's easy to see how that would be appealing in that context.
Right, and figures like Osho, who blended Tantra with modern psychology and had a very open view on sexuality, gained huge followings, but also sparked controversy.
Right, we'll get into those controversial gurus later. So we've got this distorted image coming from early scholars, then it gets picked up by the counterculture. What happened next?
Well, the New Age movement further integrated aspects of Tantra into its practices. Suddenly, everyone was talking about chakras, kundalini energy, and the power of mantras, often without fully understanding their original context.
It sounds like Tantra got simplified and repackaged for mass consumption.
You could say that, and the result is that the West often ended up with a very commercialized, watered-down version of something much more complex.
Okay, so we've got this whirlwind tour of Tantra's history and its journey to the West. Now let's dive into what our sources see as the problems with Tantra. What's the first error they call out?
The first chapter is called The Serpent in the Garden of the Soul, and it really sets the stage for how this source views Tantra. They use that biblical imagery of temptation to portray Tantra as an alluring but ultimately deceptive force, leading people away from the true path.
Interesting. So Tantra is like the forbidden fruit, tempting us with false promises.
Exactly. And the source goes on to outline several specific errors they see in Tantra's worldview and practices.
All right, let's unpack those errors. What's the first one?
One of the key errors the source highlights is Tantra's concept of dualism. Tantra sees the separation of spirit and matter, the divine and the mundane, as the root problem. It believes the separation causes suffering and alienation.
Okay, so it's about overcoming that separation and realizing that everything is one. I can see how that might appeal to people seeking a sense of unity.
However, this source argues that Tantra misrepresents the Christian view. Christianity acknowledges a separation, but it's a separation caused by sin, humanity's rebellion against God.
So it's not that there's no distinction between creator and creation, but that sin has damaged that relationship.
Precisely, and this has significant implications for how we understand suffering and the path to healing that relationship.
That makes sense. What's another error the source points out?
Another key point of contention is Tantra's view of samsara, that endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth driven by karma They see it as a wheel of suffering that we need to escape.
So not just suffering now, but suffering forever unless we achieve liberation. That does sound pretty bleak.
It does paint a dramatic picture. However, the source argues that while Christianity recognizes suffering, it doesn't see it as an inescapable cosmic law. They believe suffering is a consequence of that broken relationship with God, which can be healed.
So it's not about escaping a cycle through our own efforts, but about restoring a relationship through God's grace.
Exactly. And this leads to very different ideas about how we find liberation. Tantra emphasizes self-effort through practices and knowledge, while Christianity believes salvation comes through God's grace and Christ's sacrifice.
Okay, so the source is highlighting some fundamental differences in how Tantra and Christianity approach suffering and the path to freedom. What else do they see as problematic?
Well, Tantra talks about this feeling of disconnection from our divine source, this idea that we've forgotten our true nature. They call it vichina, a sense of being incomplete or fragmented.
And this disconnection stems from that perceived dualism we talked about earlier, right? We think we're separate, so we feel separate.
Exactly. The source, however, disagrees with Tantra's diagnosis. They argue that while humans do feel disconnected, it's not because we've forgotten some inherent divinity, it's because we've separated ourselves from God through sin.
So the solution isn't to realize some inner God, but to reconnect with the one true God.
That's the argument this source is making. They believe true wholeness and healing come from restoring our relationship with the divine, not from seeking it within ourselves.
That makes sense. Now, Tantra often associated with embracing desires, particular sexual desires. How does that fit into this critique?
That's another major area of clash between Tantra and Christian ethics. Some forms of Tantra actively integrate desires rather than suppressing them, with the idea of transmuting them for spiritual purposes.
That's very different from the Christian emphasis on self-control and purity, especially regarding sexuality. I imagine the source has some strong opinions about this.
Absolutely. They acknowledge that repressing all desires isn't healthy, but they emphasize aligning our desires with God's will, seeking purity and holiness, which often means saying no to certain desires, especially those related to sexuality.
So it's about finding that balance between acknowledging our desires and aligning them with a higher purpose, not just indulging them freely.
Right, and that's a significant point of tension between these two viewpoints, which we'll likely continue to see throughout this deep dive.
Okay, so far we've got Tantra's concept of dualism, samsara, disconnection, and its approach to desire on the source's list of errors. What else do they see as problematic?
The source also critiques Tantra's focus on unlocking unfulfilled potential. Tantra believes we all possess this dormant energy called Shakti, often linked to the divine feminine, waiting to be awakened.
Right, I've heard about Shakti, and this is where the whole Kundalini energy concept comes in, right? That coiled up energy at the base of the spine.
Yes, the idea is that this Kundalini energy can be activated through certain practices, leading to spiritual awakening. But our source takes issue with the idea that our potential comes from manipulating some internal energy. They believe any potential we have comes from God's grace and is meant to be used for His purposes.
So instead of tapping into our inner God, the source emphasizes relying on God's power and guidance.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very different perspective on where our strength and potential truly come from.
Okay, so according to the source, Tantra gets a lot wrong about dualism, suffering, human nature, desire, and even our potential. I'm starting to see why they call this chapter The Serpent in the Garden.
The source sees Tantra as presenting these alluring ideas that ultimately lead people astray from what they believe is the true path to fulfillment and wholeness.
All right, well, we've unpacked Tantra's supposed diagnosis. Now let's move on to the prescriptions and see why the source finds those problematic as well.
Tantra offers all sorts of practices and techniques as pathways to overcome those supposed errors we just discussed. These practices aim to dissolve the ego, realize a state of non-duality, and achieve liberation from suffering.
Right, things like mantra meditation, visualization, yoga, and in some cases even sexual practices. But I imagine our source finds these prescriptions just as flawed as the diagnosis, right?
You're catching on. The source argues that these practices, while seemingly appealing, miss the mark because they're based on a faulty understanding of reality and the human condition.
All right, let's dive into those critiques. What's wrong with Tantra's approach to achieving liberation?
Well, Tantra emphasizes achieving liberation through self-effort. Through mastering certain techniques and gaining esoteric knowledge, this clashes with the Christian belief that true transformation comes from God's grace, not our own doing.
So it's not about earning our way to enlightenment through practices, but surrendering to a higher power and receiving grace.
That's the key difference. The source believes relying on our own efforts ultimately leads to frustration and spiritual dead ends. True freedom comes from surrendering to God's will and allowing His grace to work in us.
That makes sense. What about Tantra's emphasis on realizing our inherent divinity? How does that square with the Christian worldview?
The source sees this as a dangerous and misleading concept. They believe it contradicts the Christian belief that humanity is created in God's image, but fallen and in need of redemption. We're not inherently divine, we're in need of a savior.
So instead of trying to awaken some inner God, we should be seeking a relationship with the God who created us.
Exactly. The source believes that focusing on our own supposed divinity leads to pride and self-reliance, while acknowledging our need for God leads to humility and dependence on His grace.
Okay, so we've got the critiques of self-effort and inherent divinity. What about Tantra's approach to desires, especially those related to sexuality? We touched on this earlier, but I'm curious to hear more about the source's perspective.
This is where the clash between Tantra and Christian ethics becomes most apparent. While some forms of Tantra see desire as something to be transmuted for spiritual purposes, the source maintains that true freedom comes from aligning our desires with God's will, not indulging them or trying to manipulate them for spiritual gain.
So it's not about using sexual energy for enlightenment, but about honoring the sacredness of sexuality within the boundaries of God's design.
Precisely. The source believes that God created sex for a specific purpose, unity, love, and procreation within the context as marriage, and that distorting or exploiting it for other ends leads to spiritual and emotional harm.
Okay, I'm starting to see a pattern here. The source is basically saying that Tantra's prescriptions are just as flawed as its diagnosis, because they're rooted in a worldview that's incompatible with Christian beliefs.
That's a great observation, and this leads us to the next layer of the source's critique, where they start to dissect some of the internal inconsistencies and logical fallacies they see within Tantra itself.
All right, I'm ready to get into the nitty-gritty. What are some of the internal contradictions that the source calls out?
One of the most striking contradictions is the tension between Tantra's emphasis on non-duality, the idea that everything is one, and its reliance on rituals, hierarchies, and the very act of striving for liberation.
I can see how that's confusing. If everything is already one, why all the effort to achieve a state of oneness? And why the need for gurus, lineages, and specific practices?
Exactly. The source points out that Tantra seems to contradict its own core principle by creating these structures of separation and hierarchy. They see it as an attempt to impose order and control on something that is, by definition, beyond such limitations.
It sounds like Tantra might be trying to have it both ways, embracing the idea of oneness while still clinging to the structures of separation.
That's a good way to put it. And this tension between non-duality and the reality of Tantra's practices is something the source finds problematic.
Okay, what other internal contradictions do they highlight?
Another key contradiction lies in Tantra's understanding of the divine. They often talk about God as this impersonal force or energy permeating everything, but then they also emphasize manipulating that divine energy through practices.
So is God an all-encompassing force, or is it something we can control and direct? It seems like they're blurring the lines a bit.
The source certainly thinks so. They argue that this inconsistency reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of God. In the Christian worldview, God is both transcendent, above and beyond our control, and immanent, present and active in the world. But He is not something we can manipulate or bend to our will.
So it's about recognizing both God's power and our own limitations, not trying to control the divine for our own purposes.
Exactly. The source believes that Tantra's attempts to manipulate divine energies stem from a desire for power and control, which ultimately leads to spiritual imbalance.
Okay, so we've got the contradictions surrounding non-duality and the nature of God. What about that whole karma thing? How does that fit into a system where there's supposedly no individual self?
That's another point of contention the source brings up. If there's no real you to be reborn, to experience the consequences of actions, then how does karma even function?
It seems like a bit of a logical loophole. If there's no individual soul to carry karma from one life to the next, then the whole concept seems to fall apart.
That's the argument the source is making. They believe Tantra borrows this concept from Hinduism without fully reconciling it with its own principles, leading to a system that is internally inconsistent.
It's like they're picking and choosing concepts from different systems without checking if they actually fit together.
That's a good analogy. And this tendency to borrow and blend ideas without careful consideration is something the source sees as a major weakness in Tantra's overall framework.
Okay, so Tantra's got some internal contradictions and some fuzzy logic going on. What else does the source take issue with?
Well, in the chapter titled The Logic Labyrinth, the source dives deep into what they see as rampant logical fallacies within Tantra. We're talking non sequiturs, appeals to authority, circular reasoning.
Can you give me an example? What's a Tantra logic fail that really stands out?
One common fallacy is the leap from interconnectedness to divinity. Just because everything is interconnected doesn't automatically mean it's all divine or part of some universal consciousness.
It's like saying because all the trees in a forest are connected through a network of roots, they're all expressions of a single tree god.
That's a great way to put it. The source argues that this kind of logic doesn't hold up under scrutiny. There's a difference between acknowledging interconnectedness and claiming that everything is therefore divine.
So the source is saying that Tantra often makes these grand claims about divinity without proficient evidence or logical justification.
That's their perspective. They believe that these claims are often based on subjective experiences or interpretations of ancient texts, rather than on sound reasoning or empirical evidence.
Okay, so Tantra has internal contradictions, fuzzy logic, and questionable claims about divinity. What else is on the source's critique list?
I have a major point of contention is Tantra's epistemology, which is essentially how we know what we know. They critique Tantra's reliance on subjective experiences as a primary source of knowledge.
But isn't personal experience a valid way of knowing things? Especially in the realm of spirituality, where direct experience is often valued.
The source acknowledges the importance of personal experience, but they argue that Tantra places too much emphasis on it, leading to a devaluation of objective truth and reason.
So one person's mystical vision might be another person's hallucination. Without some external standard of truth, it's hard to know to trust.
Exactly. The source argues that relying solely on subjective experiences makes us vulnerable to all the sorts of biases, interpretations, and even outright deception. They believe that objective truth exists, and that we can access it through reason, revelation, and the careful examination of evidence.
So it's not about throwing out personal experience altogether, but about balancing it with a healthy dose of critical thinking and discernment.
Right? And the source believes that Tantra often neglects this critical element, leading to a system that's built on shaky foundations.
Okay, so we've got the critique of subjective experience. Anything else the source finds problematic about Tantra's approach to knowledge?
They also take issue with the emphasis on esoteric knowledge, gnosis, that's only accessible to initiates or those in specific lineages. They argue that this creates an exclusive system where knowledge is guarded and controlled by a select few.
It's like a secret club where you have to earn your way in before you're allowed to know the truth.
That's how the source sees it. They believe that true spiritual knowledge should be accessible to everyone, not just the privileged few. They see this elitism as a way of controlling people and preventing them from questioning or challenging the teachings.
It also makes it difficult to critically examine those teachings if you're not deemed worthy of accessing them in the first place.
Exactly, and this lack of transparency is something the source finds deeply problematic. They believe it fosters an environment where blind faith and obedience to the guru are valued above critical thinking and independent inquiry.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here: internal contradictions, logical fallacies, and problems with Tantra's epistemology. What's next on the source's list of critiques?
Well, they also dedicate a whole chapter to debunking the pseudoscientific claims that often get attached to Tantra. They call it the veil of science. And it's all about exposing how Tantra tries to co-opt scientific language to give itself credibility.
Ooh, yes, I've definitely seen that one in action. People trying to use quantum physics or neuroscience to explain things like chakras and kundalini energy.
The source is having none of it. They systematically debunk those claims, pointing out that there's no scientific evidence to support the existence of prana, chakras, or kundalini, as they're often described in Tantra.
So it's like they're dressing up ancient mysticism in modern scientific clothing to make it seem more legitimate.
Precisely. And the source sees this as a dangerous tactic that misleads people and prevents them from seeking genuine understanding.
Okay, so we've tackled the internal workings of Tantra, the logic, the epistemology, the biases. But it doesn't stop there, right? There's also a whole section on how Tantra clashes with external reality.
That's right. In the chapter titled The Clash with Reality, the source takes Tantra's claims and tests them against scientific knowledge, historical evidence, and of course, Christian theology.
It's like holding Tantra up to a mirror and seeing if its reflection matches what we know to be true about the world.
Exactly. And the source finds some pretty significant discrepancies.
All right, let's get into those clashes. What are some of the key areas where Tantra's claims don't line up with reality?
One of the most obvious clashes is in Tantra's understanding of energy. It talks about prana, chakras, and kundalini as these real, tangible things, but from a scientific perspective, there's no evidence to support this view.
So it's like Tantra has invented its own physics, a system that doesn't align with our current understanding of the universe.
You could say that. And the source sees this as a form of pseudoscience that can be misleading and potentially harmful. They argue that promoting these ideas as scientific facts when they lack empirical support is irresponsible and can prevent people from engaging with legitimate scientific knowledge.
Okay, energy is one clash point. What else does Tantra get wrong about reality?
It also makes you bold historical claims about lineages, miracles, and the nature of the universe.
And I'm guessing those claims don't always hold up under scrutiny.
Not according to the source. They argue that Tantra often relies on legends, myths, and unverifiable personal accounts, rather than solid historical evidence.
So it's not just clashing with science, it's clashing with history as well.
That's right, and this tendency to blend historical fact with mythology is something the source finds concerning. They believe it creates a distorted view of the past and undermines the importance of seeking truth through reliable sources.
Okay, so far we've got energy, history. What's the biggest clash of all?
The ultimate clash, according to the source, is the conflict between Tantra and Christianity. They argue that these two systems are fundamentally incompatible on several key points.
All right, let's dive into that. We've been dancing around this all episode, but now it's time to really unpack the theological differences.
This is where the source really lays out their cards, arguing that Tantra and Christianity are diametrically opposed when it comes to the nature of God, humanity, morality, and salvation.
Okay, hit me with those key points. Where do these two systems diverge most dramatically?
Well, it starts with the nature of God. Tantra often portrays God as this impersonal force or energy that permeates everything.
Which is very different from the Christian God, personal, relational, transcendent.
Exactly. And this difference has huge implications for everything else. For starters, if God is just this impersonal energy field, then the whole idea of sin and salvation starts to lose its meaning.
Because there's no personal God to rebel against, no need for forgiveness or redemption.
Right, and that leads us to another major clash point, the nature of humanity. We've already talked about how Tantra sees humans as inherently divine, that whole Atman-Brahman unity thing.
Right, and that clashes with the Christian view of humanity as created in God's image but fallen, in need of grace.
Exactly. It's not about realizing our inner God, but about recognizing our need for the one true God and seeking restoration through a relationship with him.
Okay, so we've got clashing views of God, of humanity. What else is on this list of irreconcilable differences?
The source also highlights the stark contrast between Tantra's approach to morality and Christian ethics. While Tantra often leans towards relativism, the idea that there's no absolute right or wrong, Christianity is built on the belief that there are objective moral truths revealed by God.
That's a pretty big deal because it affects how we view everything from relationships and sexuality to social justice and personal responsibility.
Absolutely. And this difference in perspective leads to very different conclusions about how we should live our lives, what's acceptable and what's not.
Okay, so we've got God, humanity, morality, one last big one, right? Salvation.
Ah, yes, the ultimate goal. And here the contrast couldn't be more stark. Tantra emphasizes self-liberation through effort and knowledge.
Whereas Christianity is all about
Grace, that unmerited favor of God received through faith in Christ. It's not something we earn, it's a gift freely given.
So it's not about achieving enlightenment through our own power. It's about surrendering to a power greater than ourselves and receiving his love and forgiveness.
Exactly, and that's the fundamental difference this whole deep dive has been building toward.
So it's not just about achieving enlightenment through our own power. It's about surrendering to a power greater than ourselves and receiving his love and forgiveness.
Exactly, and that's the fundamental difference this whole deep dive has been building toward.
All right, so far we've covered a lot of ground. We've traced Tantra's origins, analyzed its core claims, debunked its pseudoscience, exposed its internal contradictions, and now we've seen how it fundamentally clashes with Christianity. Whew, it's been a lot to take in.
It has been quite a journey, but remember, this is all from the perspective of a particular source with a clear agenda.
Right. It's important to keep that in mind. But still, even if you don't agree with everything this source says, I think they raise some important questions about Tantra's claims and how they measure up against reality.
Absolutely, and that's what makes this deep dive so valuable. It's not about telling you what to think, it's about giving you the tools to think critically and engage with these ideas for yourself.
Okay, we've tackled the theoretical side of things. But what about the real-world impact? What happens when people actually buy into Tantra's promises?
That's what the next chapter explores, the potential consequences of embracing what the source sees as Tantra's errors. And they do so through a fictional story.
Story time. I'm always a sucker for a good narrative.
This one's about a guy named Ethan. His journey represents what the source sees as a real danger in following Tantra's path.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me about Ethan.
Ethan starts out like many spiritual seekers, longing for meaning, searching for something more than the everyday world can offer.
And Tantra seems to promise that something more.
Exactly. At first, Ethan is captivated by Tantra's promises of transformation, hidden powers, and direct experiences of the divine. He invests time, energy, and resources into these practices, but the deeper he goes, the more he begins to see the inconsistencies and lack of evidence supporting Tantra's claims.
So it's like the allure of Tantra blinds him to its flaws at first, but eventually reality sets in.
Right, he experiences disillusionment and a crisis of faith, feeling like he's wasted years chasing an illusion.
That's heartbreaking. But I have a feeling this isn't the end of Ethan's story.
You're right. In his moment of despair, Ethan turns to the Bible and finds solace and truth in the Christian message.
So Ethan's story is meant to be a cautionary tale, a warning about the potential pitfalls of getting caught up in Tantra's promises.
Exactly. The source is highlighting the emotional and spiritual harm that can result from investing in a system that they believe ultimately leads to emptiness and disillusionment.
Okay, so Ethan's story is a powerful illustration of the source's concerns. But is this really a common experience? Do people actually get hurt by this stuff?
That's a valid question, and it leads us to the next chapter, which takes a very interesting look at a recent trend.
Ooh, a trend. I love trends. Fill me in.
This chapter is called The Rising Tide, and it focuses on Gen Z, a generation that's grown up immersed in the internet, social media, and alternative spiritualities.
So what does Gen Z have to do with Tantra?
The source highlights a recent phenomenon where many young people who were initially drawn to New Age spirituality, including Tantra, are now converting to Christianity.
Really? That's interesting. Why is that happening?
The source suggests a few reasons. First, there's a growing disillusionment with the subjectivity and relativism of New Age beliefs. Many young people are yearning for something more solid, more grounded in objective truth.
So they're looking for answers that go beyond personal feelings and opinions.
Exactly. They're also tired of the self-centeredness that often permeates these alternative spiritualities. They want something that transcends personal growth and self-empowerment.
They want something that connects them to something bigger than themselves.
Right, and many are finding that in Christianity, particularly in the message of God's grace and the transformative power of the gospel.
So it's not just about rejecting Tantra. It's about embracing something that feels more authentic, more meaningful, and more connected to a higher purpose.
That's a great way to put it, and this trend is playing out in a very visible way online.
Okay, I have to ask, what kind of online stuff are we talking about? Give me some examples.
You'll find tons of YouTube videos where young people share their stories of transitioning from New Age practices to Christianity.
Wow, that's amazing. What kind of things are they saying?
They talk about finding freedom from fear, from the emptiness of self-centered practices, and from the confusion of contradictory teachings. They speak about the transformative power of God's grace and the peace they've found in a relationship with Christ.
They're basically saying that Tantra didn't deliver on its promises and that they found something real and lasting in Christianity.
Exactly. Their testimonies are incredibly powerful and resonate with many people searching for a deeper spiritual connection.
So this is a pretty significant trend. It's not just a few isolated cases. It's a whole generation that's questioning the spiritual path they were raised with and seeking something more grounded and authentic.
That's how the source interprets it, and they see this as a hopeful sign, indicating that people are hungry for truth and willing to challenge the prevailing cultural narratives about spirituality.
Okay, so we've gone from ancient India to modern-day YouTube, tracing Tantra's evolution, analyzing its claims, debunking its pseudoscience, and exploring its ethical and theological implications.
We've covered a lot of ground, but there's still one more piece of the puzzle to examine, right? Neo-Tantra. We touched on it earlier, but now it's time to dive into what makes it so different from traditional Tantra and why the source finds it even more problematic.
Right, Neo-Tantra. It's the version we're most likely to encounter today, but it sounds like it's strayed pretty far from Tantra's original roots. What exactly is Neo-Tantra, and how is it different?
Think of it as Tantra 2.0, a modern, westernized adaptation that's stripped of much of its traditional religious context.
So less about ancient rituals and more about...
Self-help, personal growth, and a big emphasis on sensuality and pleasure.
Ooh! I'm starting to see why this might be appealing to a modern audience. It sounds like the light version of Tantra, easier to digest, less intimidating.
In a sense, yes, but this source argues that this simplification comes at a cost.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Hit me with those costs. What's so dangerous about Neo-Tantra?
Well, for starters, it can be misleading. People might think they're engaging with this ancient, profound spiritual tradition, but they're getting a very diluted and often distorted version.
It's like those ancient wisdom books that take complex philosophies and reduce them to a few inspirational quotes on Instagram.
Exactly. That lack of depth can lead to all sorts of problems. One of the biggest dangers is the focus on the self. Neo-Tantra is often about personal empowerment, fulfilling your desires, and maximizing your own pleasure.
Which sounds a lot like the individualism that's already so prevalent in our culture.
Precisely. And the source argues that this self-centeredness is a spiritual dead end. It keeps us focused on our own needs and desires instead of connecting us to something greater than ourselves.
So Neo-Tantra might feel empowering on the surface, but it ultimately keeps us trapped in a cycle of self-gratification.
That's their perspective. They believe that true fulfillment comes from transcending the ego, not involving it.
Okay, so Neo-Tantra's got a shallow view of spirituality and a focus on the self. Anything else on the list of concerns?
Another big one is the moral relativism that often goes hand in hand with Neo-Tantra. It rejects traditional moral frameworks and promotes the idea that we should be free from any constraints, especially when it comes to sexuality.
Oh yeah, that whole sexual liberation thing could be a slippery slope, can't it? What's the source's take on that?
They believe it's a direct violation of God's design for sexuality and can lead to harmful consequences.
Okay, so Neo-Tantra's got a distorted view of spirituality, a focus on the self, a rejection of traditional morality. Anything else that makes it particularly problematic from the source's perspective?
Well, this is where we have to talk about sexual mysticism, the idea that sexual experience can be a path to spiritual enlightenment.
Right, this is where Tantra's reputation gets a bit, shall we say, controversial.
It's definitely one of the most controversial aspects, and it's something that Neo-Tantra often embraces even more wholeheartedly than traditional Tantra.
So how does sexual mysticism actually play out in these traditions? What are we talking about here?
It ranges from subtle practices like using sexual energy and visualizations to more explicit rituals that involve actual sexual acts.
And the idea is that these acts somehow lead to spiritual awakening. I can see how that would be appealing to some, but also raise some red flags from a Christian perspective.
Absolutely. And this source sees it as a dangerous and deceptive claim.
Okay, let's break this down. What's so wrong with the idea of using sex for spiritual purposes? Why is this source so against it?
From a Christian perspective, sexuality is a gift from God meant to be enjoyed within the bounds of marriage between a man and a woman. It's about love, intimacy, and creating new life. Taking something sacred and using it for personal spiritual gain is seen as a distortion of God's design.
So instead of worshiping God, you're worshiping your own desires.
Right. And that can lead to all sorts of problems like idolatry, a confusion of sensuality with spirituality, and even spiritual harm.
Okay, I'm getting the picture. But I have to ask, what about those people who claim to have had genuine spiritual breakthroughs through sexual practices? Is the source just dismissing all of that?
Not necessarily. They acknowledge that people can have powerful experiences, but they question the source of those experiences. They believe it's possible to have profound encounters that aren't actually from God, but from other spiritual forces that might not have our best interests at heart.
So it's not that the experiences aren't real, but that they might be coming from a deceptive source.
Exactly. And this is where the source expresses concern about the potential for spiritual deception in these practices. They believe that when we start messing with sexual energy and trying to manipulate spiritual forces, we open ourselves up to influences that can be harmful.
It's like opening a door to the unknown without knowing what might be lurking on the other side.
That's a good analogy. The source is urging caution and discernment when it comes to practices that involve manipulating sexual energy or engaging with the spiritual realm in unconventional ways.
Okay, I'm definitely getting the message that this is something to be approached with extreme caution, to say the least. But I have to admit, I'm still a bit curious about those famous gurus who have promoted Tantra and sexual mysticism.
Ah, you mean the enigmatic guides. That's what this next chapter is all about, taking a closer look at some of the most influential figures in the world of Tantra.
Yes. Give me the rundown. Who are we talking about?
The chapter focuses on four main figures: Osho, Aleister Crowley, Swami Muktananda, and David Deida.
Okay, I've heard of Osho. Wasn't he that super controversial guy who had a whole commune in Oregon devoted to, well, let's just say unconventional spiritual practices?
That's the one. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, later known as Osho, was a real lightning rod. He blended elements of Tantra with modern psychology, creating a very unique and liberated approach to spirituality. His ashram was known for its open attitude towards sexuality, which he believed could be harnessed for spiritual transformation.
So basically, free love and meditation in the name of enlightenment. Sounds like a recipe for controversy.
It certainly was. Osho's teachings and lifestyle attracted a large following, but he also faced accusations of cult-like behavior, financial improprieties, and even abuse.
Wow, not exactly a saintly figure then. What about the other? Who was Aleister Crowley? I feel like I've heard that name before, but I can't quite place it.
Crowley was a British occultist, often associated with the darker side of esoteric practices. He wasn't directly connected to Tantra, but his ideas about sexual magic, using sexual energy to manipulate occult forces, definitely influenced the Western understanding of Tantra.
Okay, I'm starting to see why the source is so critical of Tantra if it's associated with figures like Crowley. His reputation is pretty intense.
To put it mildly, Crowley's life was filled with scandal, controversy, and allegations of dark practices.
So we've got Osho, the free-love guru, and Crowley, the occultist. Who else is on this list of enigmatic guides?
Next up is Swami Muktananda, an Indian guru who emphasized Kundalini awakening through a system called Siddha Yoga.
Okay, so he's more focused on the energy aspect of Tantra?
Exactly. He taught that by activating Kundalini, that dormant energy at the base of the spine, one could achieve enlightenment. While his approach seemed more traditional than Osho or Crowley, Muktananda also faced accusations of sexual abuse by some of his followers, which tarnished his reputation and caused division within his community.
So another guru with a dark side. It's starting to feel like there's a pattern here.
The source certainly wants to highlight that pattern. They're trying to show that even those who present themselves as enlightened spiritual masters can be flawed, hypocritical, and even abusive. They're urging caution and discernment when it comes to placing our trust in any human teacher.
Okay, one last guru to cover. David Deoda. What's his story?
Deoda is a more contemporary figure. He's actually still alive, and he's known for his teachings on conscious sexuality, which draw on elements of Tantra but present them in a way that's more accessible and less ritualistic.
So more about personal growth and relationship dynamics than about accessing hidden powers.
Right. But even though Deoda's teachings are less overtly mystical, the source still sees them as problematic.
Why is that? What's wrong with conscious sexuality?
The source argues that, like many forms of Neo-Tantra, Deoda's teachings ultimately promote a self-centered view of spirituality that distracts from a genuine relationship with God.
So it's still about fulfilling your own desires, even if it's under the guise of conscious exploration.
That's their concern. They believe that genuine spirituality is about transcending the ego and seeking a connection with something greater than ourselves, not about endlessly pursuing our own desires and fulfillment.
Okay, so we've got four very different gurus, each with their own take on Tantra and sexual mysticism. It seems like the source's point isn't about debunking any specific individual, but rather about highlighting a broader pattern.
You got it. The source is urging us to be wary of placing our trust in any human teacher, no matter how charismatic or enlightened they may seem. They believe that the only true authority, the only one we can truly trust, is God, as revealed through the Bible.
Okay, so we've gotten a pretty thorough critique of Tantra and sexual mysticism, both in theory and practice. But before we wrap up, I have to ask, what about those people who are genuinely drawn to these practices? What's the source's message for them?
I think the source's message is twofold. First, it's a call to discernment. Don't just take everything at face value. Question the claims, look at the evidence, and be aware of the potential for deception.
So do your research, don't be naive, and don't just blindly follow a charismatic leader.
Exactly. And second, it's a call to come back to what they believe is the truth.
The truth being.
The truth of the gospel, of God's love and grace as revealed through Jesus Christ.
Okay, so if Tantra's not the answer, what is? What does the source offer as an alternative?
That's what the final chapter is all about. It's called The Serpent's Subtle Song, and it lays out the source's view of the real danger posed by Tantra and, more broadly, Hindu philosophy.
Okay, so we're going full circle back to that serpent imagery. But this time, it's not just a metaphor for temptation, it's about
spiritual deception on a grand scale. The source argues that Hindu philosophy, which underpins Tantra, is a subtle but pervasive force that's leading people away from the one true God.
wow, that's a pretty bold claim.
It is, but this source backs it up by going through some of the core tenets of Hindu philosophy and pointing out how they contradict Christian teachings.
Give me an example. What's a Hindu belief that clashes with Christianity?
One of the biggest is pantheism, the idea that everything is God, that there's no distinction between the creator and the creation.
Which is pretty much the opposite of what Christianity teaches, a distinct God who created the universe and everything in it.
Exactly, and that difference has huge implications for how we view ourselves, the world, the purpose of life.
Okay, so pantheism is one clash point. What else does the source take issue with?
Another big one is the concept of reincarnation, the idea that we are reborn over and over again until we achieve enlightenment.
Which Christianity doesn't believe in, right? It's more about one life, one death, and then judgment.
Exactly. And this difference in perspective impacts how we view our actions, our choices, and our ultimate destiny.
Okay, so pantheism, reincarnation. Anything else that rubs this source the wrong way about Hindu philosophy?
Well, they also take issue with the idea of karma, the law of cause and effect that determines our fate based on our actions.
Which, to be fair, is a concept found in other religions, too.
Right, true, but this source sees a particular problem with how karma plays out in Tantra. They argue that Tantra often presents karma as this impersonal force that binds us, almost like a cosmic debt we have to pay off.
Which doesn't leave much room for grace, forgiveness, or a loving God who wants to free us from our mistakes.
Exactly, and that's the ultimate point the source is making. They believe that Hindu philosophy, and by extension Tantra, offer a bleak and ultimately hopeless view of the human condition.
Because we're trapped in this cycle of reincarnation, bound by our karma, with no real chance of escape unless we achieve enlightenment through our own efforts. It's a pretty heavy perspective.
It is, and the source contrasts this with the Christian message of hope, forgiveness, and a God who loves us unconditionally and wants to have a relationship with us.
Okay, so this final chapter is really about drawing a clear line between two very different worldviews, the Hindu Tantric view and the Christian view. It's about understanding the underlying philosophies that shape these practices and how they impact our understanding of ourselves and the world.
Precisely, and it's urging listeners to choose wisely, to be aware of the influences that are shaping their beliefs and their lives.
So it's not just about debunking Tantra, it's about presenting an alternative, a different way of seeing ourselves, the world, and our place in it, one that's rooted in the Christian understanding of God, humanity, and salvation.
Exactly, and that's what makes this deep dive so thought-provoking. It's not just an intellectual exercise, it's an invitation to examine our own beliefs and consider what we believe is ultimately true.
Right, we've reached the end of our deep dive into Tantra. We've covered a lot of ground from its origins to its modern interpretations. We've explored the practices, the controversies, the philosophical underpinnings, and the theological clashes with Christianity.
It's been quite a journey, and I hope listeners have found it insightful.
I think the most important takeaway is the importance of being aware. Aware of the influences that are shaping our worldview, our beliefs, and our choices. Aware of the potential for deception, even in things that appear ancient and wise. And aware of the different paths available to us and the ultimate destination they lead to.
Well said. So as you continue your own journey, remember to approach everything with discernment, with a critical mind, and most importantly, with a heart open to truth, wherever it may lead.
Beautifully said. That's all the time we have for today's deep dive, but the conversation doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking truth. We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into the fascinating world of ideas.